Hi, everyone. Today we are presenting our article, Ruling Violently, the Exercise of Criminal Governance by the Mexican cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, also known as CJNJ. This paper examines how CJNG, one of the most powerful and rapidly growing cartels in Mexico, is able to control territory and influence communities. Instead of just focusing on drug trafficking, the article looks at how CJNG actually governs populations, using a combination of violence and social influence. Throughout this presentation, we will break down the problem the author addresses, the background behind it, how they studied it, and what they ultimately found about the CJNG's strategy for maintaining power. Before this study, research already showed that criminal organizations can act as governing forces, especially in areas where the state is weak or absent. In these situations, the government often struggles to provide basic services like security, law enforcement, or economic stability. Because of this, criminal groups are able to step in and fill that gap. Instead of just committing crimes, they begin to create systems of control and order over the population, which can shape everyday life in those areas. However, while this idea of criminal governments has been studied in other cases, CJNG itself remained relatively understudied, and this is why this makes the research so important. To better understand how these groups govern, scholars focus on two main strategies that criminal organizations tend to use. The first is coercion, which refers to the use of violence, threats, and intimidation to control territory and influence people's behavior. This creates fear, which discourages resistance. The second is legitimacy, which comes from providing services or benefits to the population, such as security, goods, or a sense of order. This can make communities more willing to accept or even support the group. Most organizations don't rely on just one of these strategies. Instead, they combine both coercion and legitimacy to maintain control more effectively over time. To apply these ideas specifically to our case with the CJNG, the authors use a qualitative research approach. Since it is not possible or safe to directly study cartel members, they rely on a combination of different sources to build their analysis. These include existing academic research, Mexican news reports, and CJNG's own public messaging, such as videos posted on social media. They also incorporate insights from experts who study organized crime, which helps them better interpret what is happening on the ground. By combining all of these resources together, the authors are able to develop a clearer and more reliable understanding of how the CJNG operates and governs in the real world situations, even without direct access to the organization itself. Before getting into CJNG specifically, it's important to understand what researchers already knew going into the study. Scholars already found that criminal organizations can actually govern territory, especially in areas where the state is weak or not fully present. In those situations, power isn't controlled only by the government. Instead, you get what's called hybrid governance, where both the state and criminal groups share authority. Researchers also identified two main ways these groups maintain control: coercion and legitimacy. Coercion involves violence, threats, and intimidation, while legitimacy comes from providing protection, order, or basic goods and services. While these ideas were well established, CJNG itself had not been studied in depth, which is what this article begins to address. This slide focuses on the problem the article is trying to solve. Even though researchers had general theories about criminal governments, most of that work was broad and not focused on specific organizations. At the same time, CJNG had become one of the most powerful and rapidly expanding cartels in Mexico. So the issue wasn't a lack of theory, but a lack of clear, real world understanding of how a group like CJNG actually applies these strategies. This created a gap between theory and reality. We had concepts like coercion and legitimacy, but we didn't know exactly how CJNG used them to control territory and influence communities. This study aims to bridge that gap. To address this, the authors take a qualitative approach to studying CJNG. Because criminal governance is difficult to measure with data, especially when much of the data and the activity is hidden, they rely on multiple real world sources and statistics. These include expert insights from people who study organized crime, social media content produced by CJNG itself, and Mexican news reports that document events on the ground. They also compare these sources with existing academic research to ensure accuracy. By combining all of this information, the authors are able to build a clear picture of how CJNG actually governs and maintains control in practice.
The authors use their qualitative research in different data sources to show their main finding, which is that the CJNG governs through a dual system of coercion and legitimacy. First, they find that coercion is the main tool the cartel uses to control territory. In the article, coercion means using or threatening violence to achieve the cartel's goals. CJNG relies on organized military style force through drones, armored trucks, explosives, and high power weapons. This violence isn't random. It is used deliberately to fight rivals, push back against the state, and keep members in line. The authors argue that this steady, overwhelming use of force strengthens the group internally and discourages anyone from defecting. Second, the authors identify the other side of the system, selective legitimacy building. Even though the CJNG is extremely violent, it also tries to present itself as a protector of local communities. It sometimes hands out food or supplies, provides limited security, and punishes people who commit crimes like theft. These actions create the impression that the cartel brings order where the government is weak. This doesn't mean people fully support CJNG, but it does reduce resistance and makes it easier for the cartel to operate. I would like to dive into two specific examples of this dual system. First, an example of the coercion. The article notes that CJNG has even brought down a Mexican military helicopter using a rocket-propelled grenade in May of 2015, which emphasizes the level of sophistication they have achieved. To demonstrate their legitimacy as defenders of the people, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, members of the CJNG gave out food packages and bags of groceries from the back of their pickup trucks to local residents. Taken together, these findings support the author's argument that CJNG's rapid growth comes from using both strategies at the same time. Violence helps the cartel seize territory, while providing selective services helps them hold on to it. The evidence from news reports, expert interviews, and documented cartel actions matches what the authors expected and strengthens their claim that CJNG's style of governance is different from many other criminal groups in Mexico.
All right, so to start off with my slide, we have the conclusions. This slide breaks down the key conclusions from the research. First, the CJNG isn't just a cartel. They've created their own system of governance in the areas they control, which is what the article calls a parallel system. While violence is a big part of how they maintain control, it is not the sole thing. They also build legitimacy by providing things like security and resources to communities. That combination of force and legitimacy is what makes them so effective and allows them to stay in power. Because of this, they don't fully replace the state, but they operate alongside it and sometimes even challenge it. And the research also shows that relying mainly on military force hasn't worked well, and in some cases has actually made violence worse. All right, to start off with this slide, the effective policy must target this little excerpt at the top. Um, this part shows what effective policy should actually target. Instead of just focusing on violence, the research suggests going after cartel finances, like cutting off profits and money laundering networks. It also highlights the need to address corruption and lack of accountability within the government, because those allow cartels to keep operating. And finally, improving basic state services is important so people don't have to rely on cartels in the first place. To continue this little second box, um, to answer the main question, yes, the research does solve the puzzle. It shows that the CJNG controls areas using both violence and support. They use fear to take control, but also provide things like security or goods, which makes people less likely to resist. And that combination explains why they've been able to grow so quickly, especially in areas where the government is weak or not very present. On to the next slide, we have what's left to be known. This slide focuses on what's still unknown and what future research needs to look at. The authors say we still don't fully understand the CJNG's internal structure, basically how it's organized behind the scenes. They also point out that we need more research on their alliance networks, especially how they build relationships with other criminal groups. And one of the biggest unanswered questions is why smaller groups choose to work with CJNG instead of rivals like the Shinola cartel. Answering those questions would help explain how the CJNG has been able to keep growing and stay so powerful over time. Now for this little visual that I created. This visual helps show what the article calls a parallel order, quote unquote. Basically, instead of the government being fully in control, CJNG creates its own system alongside it. It's this. So on one side, like the state weak present side, this black side, you have the official government, laws, police, and institutions. But on the other side, the CJNG side, the red and green side, they're also enforcing rules, controlling territory, and influencing people's daily lives. That's why it's called a parallel order, because both systems are operating at the same time. But in some areas, CJNG is actually the one with more power. And this quote on the bottom of the slide really sums it up, so gives the whole picture. Criminal governance has created a new system where CJNG dominates. So they're not just a cartel anymore, they're acting like a governing force. That concludes ruling violently presentation, the exercise of criminal governance by the Mexican cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, the CJNG.